When most people picture the naval war against Japan, they imagine the sweeping carrier armadas of the United States Navy, the Essex-class giants and fast battleships pushing westward across the Pacific. Yet, by 1945, another fleet sailed alongside them, flying a different flag. The British Pacific Fleet, often overlooked in American retellings, represented the culmination of Britain's naval recovery after years of war in Europe. And for Japanese pilots, its arrival meant facing a kind of enemy they were not prepared for, one that refused to burn, break, or retreat the way they expected. By early 1945, Japan's kamikaze campaign had turned the Pacific into a killing ground. Thousands of young pilots were trained to crash their aircraft into Allied ships, seeking to trade their lives for devastating psychological and physical impact. American crews had suffered terribly at places like Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. The sight of an aircraft diving out of the clouds had become synonymous with horror. But when the kamikazes turned their eyes toward the British carriers, they found something different. The British fleet was smaller, less famous, and logistically strained. But its carriers, illustrious, indefatigable, victorious, formidable, were armored in a way the Japanese had never encountered. Instead of thin flight decks of wood and steel, the Royal Navy had built its carriers like fortresses. The hangars were enclosed and the decks made of armored plate several inches thick. Japanese dive bombers and suicide pilots quickly learned that even direct hits often failed to cripple these ships. Fires were contained, flight operations resumed within hours, and the carriers kept launching sorties as if nothing had happened. To the Japanese, this resilience seemed almost supernatural. Reports began circulating among Japanese naval air commands that British carriers were unsinkable. It was an exaggeration, but it carried a grain of truth. A kamikaze could smash an American wooden deck into blazing ruin. The same impact on a British carrier left little more than scorched paint. In one famous instance, HMS Formidable took a direct hit from a Zero carrying a 500-pound bomb. The explosion tore up part of the deck, but failed to halt operations for long. Within minutes, replacement aircraft were taking off over the still smoldering steel. To the Japanese pilots preparing for their final missions, that kind of defiance mattered. Dying for the Emperor was one thing. Dying for nothing, against a target that refused to die with you, was something else entirely. For the men aboard the British Pacific Fleet, survival was never left to chance. Years of combat in the Mediterranean had hardened the Royal Navy into a force that understood how to absorb punishment without collapsing. That experience translated into every detail of their carrier's design and operation, and it was precisely this that unnerved Japanese airmen who faced them. The British had learned their lessons the hard way. From the burning wrecks at Crete, the torpedo hits in the Mediterranean, and the devastating German air raids that crippled ships at Scapa Flow and Alexandria. By 1945, no navy on Earth was more skilled in layered anti-aircraft defense. The American fleet, for all its size and firepower, fought in open formations optimized for offensive reach. The British fleet moved more compactly, with interlocking fields of fire that turned every attack into a storm of metal. Each carrier was ringed by destroyers and cruisers whose gunners had drilled endlessly in radar-guided coordination. As kamikazes approached, layers of flak from Bofors, Oerlikons, and high-angle 4.5-inch guns created a lethal curtain. Japanese pilots described these defenses as walls of light that shredded formations before they could dive. Even those who broke through found themselves blinded by tracer fire, striking into armored decks that refused to yield. It wasn't just the equipment, it was the discipline. British crews operated with a methodical calm that belied the chaos around them. Firefighting drills ran daily. Gun crews rotated on short rest. Damage control teams had practiced sealing compartments until it was a reflex. When an aircraft hit, they didn't panic. They acted. During the Okinawa campaign, when kamikaze attacks reached their ferocious peak, ships like HMS Indefatigable, Formidable, and Victorious were struck repeatedly yet remained operational within hours. The Japanese command could scarcely believe it. They had expected the same infernos that consumed so many American decks. Instead, reconnaissance photos showed British carriers still launching sorties the next day. Among Japanese pilots, rumors grew. They said the British had built their decks from concrete, or that the ships carried special fireproof crews. Some even believed they were decoys, meant to draw suicide planes away from the Americans. But the truth was simpler: the Royal Navy had mastered survival. That combination of armor, discipline, and relentless training transformed fear into reputation. To dive on an American carrier was dangerous. To dive on a British one was, increasingly, suicidal without reward. And that perception spread quickly across Japanese airfields in the final months of the war. If the Americans brought overwhelming quantity to the Pacific, the British brought precision. Their fleet was smaller, their carriers carried fewer aircraft, and yet their strikes often hit with a level of coordination that surprised even their allies. This wasn't accidental, it was born out of necessity. Where the U.S. Navy could afford mass squadrons, the Royal Navy operated within tight resource limits. Every sortie had to count. British carrier air wings, usually composed of a blend of Seafires, Hellcats, Avengers, and Fireflies, were trained to function as surgical units rather than blunt instruments. They relied on timing, strict discipline, and constant communication between air and sea. At sea, British radar systems guided interceptors with remarkable precision. The Royal Navy had refined radar-controlled fighter direction since the early years of the war, when survival against German and Italian bombers depended on it. By 1945, this technology had matured into a defensive web that Japanese pilots found almost impossible to slip through undetected. Many never even saw their target before being jumped by British fighters vectored in with mathematical accuracy. The British also emphasized pilot endurance and adaptability. While American pilots rotated home after a fixed number of missions, many British aviators served longer tours, accumulating experience that translated into instinctive reactions under fire. The Japanese, who had once prided themselves on unmatched air discipline, now faced opponents whose cool precision mirrored their own pre-war ethos, but with far better machines and intelligence. During raids over Sakishima and Formosa, Japanese pilots reported frustration not only at the physical toughness of British ships, but at the uncanny timing of their defenses. British radar screens would light up with inbound blips miles away, fighter control officers barking calm instructions as the combat air patrol moved to intercept. When the first kamikazes emerged from cloud cover, they found British aircraft already on their tails, and flak patterns tracking their dives with relentless accuracy. This efficiency had psychological weight. Japanese officers began to warn their pilots that attacks on British carriers were low-success missions. Kamikaze doctrine depended on certainty, the promise that a man's death would at least destroy the enemy. When that promise dissolved in steel decks and coordinated defense, morale suffered. Even among American observers, the British method was quietly respected. "They fight smaller but tighter," one U.S. commander remarked, noting how few ships were ever lost to fire or panic. For the Japanese, that tightness was terrifying. A fleet that moved like a machine, where even death arrived with discipline. By the spring of 1945, the British Pacific Fleet had joined the American Fifth Fleet for the assault on Okinawa, the bloodiest and most relentless campaign of the Pacific War. The Japanese High Command unleashed the full fury of its suicide tactics in an attempt to destroy the invasion fleets. They called the offensive Operation Tengo. For Allied sailors, it became a test of endurance under the most violent skies ever recorded at sea. The Royal Navy's Task Force 57, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 5 cruisers, and a screen of destroyers, took position on the western flank. Their mission was to neutralize Japanese airfields in the Sakishima Islands, cutting off Okinawa's aerial reinforcements. What they met instead was wave after wave of kamikazes. The first serious attacks came in early April. On the 4th, HMS Indefatigable was hit directly on the flight deck by a suicide plane. The bomb exploded on impact, the aircraft disintegrated, and within 30 minutes the ship was launching aircraft again. 2 days later, Formidable took her turn. A Zero carrying a 500-pound bomb slammed into the deck, tearing a crater in the armor and scattering burning aviation fuel. Yet firefighting teams contained the blaze within 6 minutes. Pilots who had been on deck at the moment of impact returned to their cockpits by afternoon. American correspondents watching from nearby task groups were stunned. The U.S. carriers, made for speed and air capacity, could be crippled by a single successful strike. British ships, slower and fewer, seemed to shrug off hits that would have sent an Essex-class carrier into dock for months. Their decks are like the side of a battleship, one U.S. observer noted. They burn, but they don't break. For the Japanese, that realization spread quickly. Pilots who had been told that one clean dive would destroy a ship began returning from missions reporting failure, or didn't return at all. The Imperial Navy's radio intercepts recorded growing frustration. British carriers resist destruction. One intercepted message read, "Many of our comrades lost in vain." The difference lay in doctrine as much as armor. The Royal Navy's firefighting, damage control, and compartmentalization drills were second nature. Every sailor knew his post. Every hose had a designated handler. Fires were attacked from multiple points instantly. Ammunition stores were sealed within seconds of impact. The result was a fleet that refused to panic. As the Okinawa campaign dragged into May, Japanese airmen began to whisper a bitter joke. Better to find an American ship. You might take it with you. It was gallows humor, but it carried truth. The British fleet was no longer simply a target. It had become a symbol of futility. When the kamikaze threat finally faded and Japan's defenses crumbled, the Imperial Navy's surviving officers took stock of what had gone wrong. Their reports painted a grim picture, but amid the chaos, one conclusion stood out clearly. British ships were harder to kill. Even before the surrender, Japanese intelligence had compiled accounts from returning pilots that described the British carriers as ironclad demons, a phrase that found its way into post-war interrogations. The fear wasn't born from superstition alone. Post-war analysis revealed that British carriers absorbed damage far more efficiently than their American counterparts. Armor that had added thousands of tons to their displacement proved to be the single most important design decision of the war. While it limited aircraft capacity, it saved ships and men. The Japanese had designed their tactics to exploit psychological impact as much as destruction. When that failed, the entire doctrine lost its teeth. American naval officers quietly took notice. Reports from the British Pacific Fleet's performance influenced early post-war design studies for armored flight decks on U.S. carriers. Though the Americans preferred lighter, more spacious decks for jet operations, the British example proved that survivability could not be ignored. The fleet air arms conduct during the Okinawa and Sakishima campaigns became a textbook in endurance and damage control. For the British sailors themselves, their achievements went largely unsung at home. The war in Europe had ended just as they joined the Pacific fight, and the nation was exhausted. Yet, within naval circles, the reputation was sealed. When Japanese veterans spoke of the terrifying futility of striking a British carrier, it confirmed what the Royal Navy had always believed. The measure of a fleet wasn't in tonnage or headlines, but in how it held its line under fire. In the years after the war, when Japanese officers were interviewed for Allied histories, several admitted they preferred to attack American ships when given a choice. Not out of respect for size, but because at least then their deaths might count for something. Against the British, they said, the effort often ended with nothing. A dive into an armored deck that left only smoke and a brief flicker of flame. That perception endured long after the guns fell silent. In naval academies and engineering rooms, the British Pacific Fleet became a case study in what design philosophy and discipline could achieve against impossible odds. The men who sailed those ships never claimed glory, but among their enemies they had earned something rarer: fear and respect. The story of why Japanese pilots feared the British fleet more than the American one isn't just about armor or aircraft. It's about the psychology of warfare, the point at which courage meets futility. The Royal Navy's presence in the Pacific proved that strength didn't always depend on size or numbers. It came from preparation, discipline, and the refusal to yield even when the sky itself was falling. For Japan's young aviators, trained to believe that sacrifice would guarantee victory, the British fleet represented an enemy that rendered sacrifice meaningless. They faced ships that burned but didn't sink, crews that stood their ground, and a navy that embodied quiet, unshakable resolve. When the war finally ended, those same British carriers stood anchored beside their American allies in Tokyo Bay, undefeated, unbroken, and living proof that endurance can be its own kind of power. If you enjoyed this story of the Royal Navy's forgotten triumph, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, And what moment from this incredible fleet's history inspired you the most?